Mark had always preferred solitude. The mountain cabin he built on the edge of a forest was his escape from the noise and chaos of the world below. Life was simpler up here. The air was fresh, the views were stunning, and the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of an eagle. It had been this way for years. But on one cold, stormy night, everything was about to change. Mark sat by the fire, his boots kicked off, a cup of coffee in hand. The storm outside raged, the wind howling through the trees, and the rain beating against the cabin windows. He had learned to love the storms. They gave him a sense of peace, as if the world outside didn't exist, only the warm glow of his fire and the comfort of his isolation. But then there was a knock, a soft, hesitant knock at the door. Mark raised an eyebrow. He rarely had visitors. His cabin was in a remote part of the mountains, miles away from the nearest neighbor. No one ever came by. He stood up slowly, setting his coffee down and walking toward the door. The knocking came again, this time louder and more urgent. He opened the door, half expecting to see someone lost in the storm. But instead, a woman stood before him. She was soaked through, her long black hair dripping wet, and her clothes clung to her slender frame. Her pale face was framed by the dark locks of hair that hung around it like a curtain, and her eyes, a strange shade of violet, met his with an intensity that made him pause. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his voice a little rough from surprise. The woman didn't speak right away. She stood there for a moment, looking at him with those strange eyes, as though she were sizing him up. Her gaze flicked behind him, into the warmth of the cabin, and then back at him. I'm lost," she said, her voice soft but tinged with an accent Mark couldn't quite place. "The storm, it's too strong. I need shelter." Mark hesitated for a moment, the old instinct to trust no one creeping up on him. But something about her seemed different. She didn't look like a regular traveler. There was an air of mystery about her, a sense of being out of place. And yet she was clearly in need of help. He couldn't turn her away. "Come inside," Mark said, stepping aside to let her in. She gave him a faint smile, the corners of her lips twitching slightly, and stepped into the warmth of the cabin. Mark closed the door behind her, feeling a strange tension rise in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but something about her made him uneasy. "Thank you," she said as she walked into the cabin. Her gaze swept around the room, her eyes taking in every detail, as though she were memorizing the place. Mark watched her carefully as she moved toward the fire, her damp clothes dripping onto the floor. "Are you all right?" Mark asked. "You're soaked through." "I'll be fine," she said. "The storm caught me by surprise." Mark didn't press further. Instead, he grabbed a towel from the small bathroom and handed it to her. She took it with a quiet nod but didn't dry herself off immediately. Instead, she stared into the fire, her expression distant. "Where did you come from?" Mark asked, leaning against the counter. "There's no one for miles around here." "I was traveling. From a long way," she said, her voice quiet. "I didn't expect to find anyone here, but it seems the storm had other plans." Mark nodded, though he didn't fully believe her. There was something strange about her story, and something even stranger about her presence in his cabin. Her eyes glinted in the firelight, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something important. "I'll make you something to eat," Mark said, trying to break the silence. "You should get some rest, too. You can sleep on the couch for the night." She turned her head slightly at the mention of rest, her eyes flickering toward him. "Thank you. I'm not used to staying in one place for long." That was an odd thing to say. Mark didn't press her on it, though. Instead, he busied himself in the kitchen, making a simple stew that would warm her up. She hadn't offered much information, but he wasn't in the mood to interrogate her. He could tell she was exhausted, and probably scared of being out in the storm. The minutes passed, and the wind howled louder outside, rattling the windows. The cabin was small, but it had a comfort to it, a calm that felt like the perfect antidote to the wildness of the world beyond. Mark set the stew on the table, and they ate in silence. As they finished their meal, Mark tried to ignore the feeling that still hung in the air. She wasn't acting like someone who was just lost. She didn't seem like a regular traveler. She was too calm, too collected for someone who had just been caught in a storm. Mark stood up, clearing the dishes from the table. As he turned to walk back into the kitchen, he caught sight of her eyes again. She was staring at him, her gaze intense, her lips slightly parted. There was something in the way she looked at him that made his heart beat faster. "Thank you," she said again, her voice soft, but carrying an unspoken weight. "For everything." Mark nodded, his throat tight. "No problem." He turned away, but just as he did, he heard her voice again, softer this time. "You don't know what you've done, but you will. You'll understand soon enough." Mark froze, his back to her, and for a moment, the cabin felt colder, the air thicker. What did she mean by that? What was she really here for? The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, Mark's world had just begun to shift. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind howled outside the cabin, and the rain lashed against the windows, but inside there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the quiet presence of the woman who had called herself Lyra. Mark sat across from her, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the fire, but more often than not, his gaze was drawn back to her. She hadn't said much since their meal. Instead, she had remained silent, her violet eyes watching the flames, her expression distant and unreadable. For a moment, Mark had almost forgotten how strange she seemed. Her pale skin, her unusual eyes, the way she seemed so calm, even in a strange place. But now, the silence was starting to feel heavier. He couldn't ignore the questions swirling in his mind. "Where did you really come from, Lyra?" Mark asked, his voice breaking the silence. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes flicked toward him, her gaze sharp and calculating. Then, almost as if deciding something, she finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I come from a faraway place," she said, her tone carrying an air of finality. "A place beyond your stars." Mark furrowed his brow. He had a feeling she wasn't talking about another town or city, and the way she said it made him wonder if she wasn't referring to any place on Earth at all. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward. "Another country. Another planet." Lyra's eyes sparkled with something Mark couldn't quite place. For a moment, she looked almost amused. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said, her lips curling into a faint smile. Mark stared at her, uncertainty twisting in his gut. What was she playing at? There was something in her expression that felt both alluring and dangerous. "I've heard strange things in my life," Mark said, trying to sound confident, though the unease was creeping back into his chest. "I think I can handle a good story." Lyra seemed to study him for a moment, as though considering whether she should trust him with the truth. Then, with a sigh, she finally spoke. "I'm not from your world, Mark. I'm not even from your galaxy," she said, her voice calm, as if this was a simple fact. "I'm from a place far beyond the stars, you know." Mark blinked. This was a joke, right? But the way she said it, the sincerity in her voice, told him she wasn't kidding. He had never been one to believe in the unbelievable, but something about Lyra's presence made him question everything he thought he knew. "Okay," Mark said slowly, trying to wrap his mind around her words. "If you're not from Earth, then where are you from? And why are you here?" Lyra's gaze turned dark, almost haunted. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Her eyes lowered to the fire again, and Mark thought she might not answer him. But then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she spoke again. "I come from a place called Varen. It's a planet in another star system. Far from here. My people, we are not like humans," she said, her voice trailing off. Mark leaned forward. This wasn't just some crazy story anymore. Something about the way she said it, the way she avoided looking at him, told him this was no simple tale. Not like humans. What do you mean? He asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Lyra hesitated, clearly struggling with her words. Finally, she looked him in the eye. My people are different, she said. We are vampiric in nature. We don't need blood, but we feed off energy. Life energy. And we live much longer than you do. Mark couldn't help but stare at her, his mind racing. Vampires. She wasn't talking about the mythological monsters of folklore, was she? The word had always carried a sense of horror, but the way Lyra said it was nothing like the stories. Wait, energy. Mark repeated, trying to make sense of her words. You mean, you feed off life energy? Like how? Lyra's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something dangerous in her expression. She took a deep breath, her fingers clenching into fists as though she were controlling herself. It's not something I can explain easily, she said quietly. But imagine this. Every living thing has energy. Plants, animals, humans. It's like a force that flows through us. My people can absorb that energy, take it into ourselves, and it keeps us strong, keeps us alive for hundreds, even thousands of years. Mark's mind was spinning. This was more than just a strange story. This was a revelation, and it was changing everything he knew about the world. And you're one of these people? Mark asked, his voice low. Lyra nodded, her expression almost unreadable. I am, she said, but that's not all. My people have enemies, dangerous enemies, and I've been running from them. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Enemies. What kind of enemies could someone like Lyra have? And why was she here, in his cabin, all alone? Why are they after you? Mark asked, his curiosity giving way to concern. Lyra's face hardened, and she seemed to shrink inward, as though the weight of the question was too much to bear. I escaped, she whispered. I had to. They want me back. I'm not supposed to be here. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, and Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just a lost traveler looking for shelter from a storm. This was something much bigger, something he didn't fully understand, but he knew he couldn't turn away from now. Lyra stood up slowly, her eyes locked on him, with an intensity that made his heart race. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into, Mark, she said, her voice heavy with warning. But you will. Mark stared at her, uncertainty clouding his mind. What did she mean by that? And why did it feel like his life was about to be changed forever? The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind only thick clouds that hung low in the sky. The air was cool and damp, and the silence in the cabin was heavier than before. Mark sat at the small kitchen table, staring into his cup of coffee, trying to wrap his mind around everything Lyra had told him. She wasn't just a strange woman. She wasn't even from Earth. She was from another planet, a vampire-like being who fed off energy. Mark didn't know what to believe, but something about her, something in the way she looked at him, the way she spoke, told him it wasn't a lie. Lyra was sitting across the room, her back turned to him as she stared out the window. Her long dark hair hung loosely over her shoulders, and her pale skin almost seemed to glow in the soft light of the morning. She looked calm, as though nothing in the world could touch her, but Mark knew better. She had enemies, and they were dangerous. Mark had never been one for trouble, but somehow it had found him. You're still here, Mark said, breaking the silence. His voice was almost too quiet. Lyra turned her head slightly, her violet eyes locking with his. Where else would I go? She replied, her voice cold but steady. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't know. I figured you'd want to leave, get as far away from here as possible. Lyra stood up and walked toward him, her movements fluid and graceful, like she was gliding. I will leave soon, she said, her tone sharp. But I can't leave yet, not until I'm sure it's safe. Mark's heart raced. Safe from what? Lyra's gaze darkened, and her eyes flashed with something that reminded Mark of a storm on the horizon. From them, she said. "The ones who are hunting me." Mark stood up quickly, the tension in the air thickening. "What do you mean, hunting you? Who are they?" Lyra stepped closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. "They're called the Gorathians, a ruthless, militaristic race. They want to control everything: planets, stars, entire galaxies. And I am a threat to their plans." Mark's chest tightened. "Why? What makes you so special?" She paused, her face unreadable. "I have knowledge," she said. "I know things they don't want anyone to know. And I have abilities. Abilities that could stop them." Mark could barely process her words. The idea of a ruthless alien race hunting Lyra, hunting her because she knew something that could stop them, was almost too much to handle. But the fear in her eyes made him realize she wasn't just telling a story. She was running for her life. He took a step toward her, suddenly aware of how close they were. "Is that why you're here? Why you came to me?" Lyra nodded slowly. "Yes, I needed to disappear. I needed a place where they wouldn't find me. But I think I made a mistake." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" Lyra turned away, walking to the window again, her face shadowed. "I didn't realize how close they were. They must have found me after I escaped. They have advanced technology, ships that can track me, no matter where I go." Mark's stomach sank. "So they're coming for you?" She nodded again, but this time, she didn't seem so sure. "They're coming. And they won't stop until they have me." A chill ran through Mark's spine. He wasn't just dealing with a lost traveler anymore. He was in the middle of something much bigger, something that could change everything. The silence between them grew heavy, and Mark's mind raced. He had no idea how to help her, but one thing was certain: he couldn't just turn her away. He'd already let her into his home, into his life. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was someone in need, someone he couldn't abandon. "Is there anything we can do?" Mark asked. "Anything I can do to help?" Lyra turned to face him, her eyes softening for a moment, but then the tension returned. "I don't know. But if they're close, if they know where I am, we won't have much time." Before Mark could respond, there was a sudden loud noise, like something hitting the roof of the cabin. Both Mark and Lyra froze, their eyes snapping to the ceiling. The noise came again, and this time it was followed by a low, humming sound, something mechanical. Mark's heart raced. He knew exactly what it was. "They'd found us," Lyra said, her voice sharp with fear. Mark didn't have time to think. He ran to the window, peering outside. In the distance, he could see it, a massive ship, black and sleek, hovering just above the treetops. It was impossible to mistake. The ship wasn't from Earth. It was one of the Gorathian ships Lyra had described. The ship hovered for a moment, its engines humming loudly, then descended lower, its massive shadow stretching over the ground. Mark felt a sense of panic rising in his chest. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice tight. Lyra was already moving, her eyes scanning the room, her body tense with readiness. "Follow me," she said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the back door. "I know a way." Mark didn't hesitate. He followed her out into the cold mountain air, his boots crunching on the snow as they sprinted through the forest. The Gorathian ship was still hovering in the distance, but they couldn't stay here. They had to move fast. As they ran, Mark's mind raced. He had no idea what Lyra's enemies could do, how powerful they really were. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let them take her without a fight. He couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. "We need to find shelter," Lyra said, her voice breathless. "Somewhere they can't track us." Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They couldn't outrun them forever, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to survive this. The hunt had begun. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted through the thick forest behind Lyra. The cold air bit at his skin, and the snow crunched beneath his boots. He could hear the distant hum of the Gorathian ship behind them, but he didn't dare look back. If he did, it might slow him down. Lyra was ahead, moving swiftly, her steps light and purposeful. She knew where she was going, and Mark did his best to keep up, though his legs burned from the effort. He could feel his pulse in his throat, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The fear in Lyra's eyes had fueled him, making him realize that their lives were on the line. The sound of the ship grew louder, closer now. Mark could almost feel the vibrations in the air, the pressure of something massive moving overhead. It was hunting them. "Lyra," Mark shouted, his voice almost lost in the wind. "Where are we going?" Lyra didn't answer at first. She pushed forward, her face set in determination, her dark hair whipping around her face. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "There's a cave," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "It's hidden. No one can track us there." Mark's eyes scanned the trees around them. The forest seemed endless, the snow-covered ground stretching in every direction. How could she know where to go in such a vast place? "We don't have time," he yelled, panic creeping into his voice. The Gorathian ship was getting too close. "I know," she said, not breaking her stride. "Just follow me." They pushed through the snow, their breath coming in ragged gasps, the only sound the thudding of their feet and the hum of the ship above. Mark's thoughts raced. How had things gotten so out of control? One moment, he was living peacefully in his cabin, and now he was running for his life with an alien woman from another planet, being hunted by a race that seemed unstoppable. The Gorathians weren't just dangerous. They were powerful. They had advanced technology, ships that could track Lyra no matter where she went. And Mark realized that if he didn't stay with her, if he didn't help her, they would both be lost. Suddenly, Lyra stopped. Mark almost collided with her, but he managed to stop just in time. She held up her hand, signaling for him to stay quiet. They stood there in the deep silence of the forest, the storm now a distant memory. Mark's heart raced, his breath coming in quick bursts as he waited for her to make the next move. His eyes darted around, expecting the worst at any moment. The ship was close, so close. He could feel it in the air, the weight of it pressing down on him. Then from the trees ahead, Lyra pointed. Mark's eyes followed her finger, and there it was, a dark opening in the rock face, barely visible in the shadows of the trees. "The cave," Lyra said, her voice a low whisper. "Hurry." They ran again, faster this time, pushing through the snow and over the uneven ground. Mark stumbled once but caught himself, his eyes locked on the cave entrance. They were almost there. As they reached the cave, Lyra grabbed his arm and pulled him inside, out of the cold. They ducked into the darkness, and Lyra quickly moved to the back of the cave, her figure vanishing into the shadows. Mark followed, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Inside, it was cooler than outside, but it was shelter. For now, it was enough. Lyra motioned for Mark to stay close. She had a look on her face, a look that said they weren't safe yet. Mark nodded, his breath still heavy from the run. He could hear the Gorathian ship circling above, its engines roaring as it searched for them. "How do we get rid of them?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra's eyes flicked to him, her expression serious. "We can't. Not right now. The only thing we can do is stay hidden." Mark looked at her, his mind racing. He didn't know what kind of technology the Gorathians had, but he knew they wouldn't stop looking, and they would find them eventually if they didn't act fast. "What do you mean, stay hidden?" Mark asked. "You said they can track you." "I know," she said, her voice tight, "but the cave is shielded. They won't be able to find us unless they come inside. And if they do, we'll have a fight on our hands." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. "A fight." Lyra nodded. "They'll come. They won't stop until they have me." Mark's mind whirled with fear. He had no weapons, no training, nothing. He was just a regular guy, living his life, minding his business, until this woman showed up on his doorstep, and now he was facing an alien army. He was in over his head. "Is there anything we can do?" Mark asked, his voice shaking with uncertainty. Lyra looked at him, her eyes softening for a moment. "You're already helping by staying with me. I don't want you to get hurt." Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together now." Lyra gave him a small smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes, like she knew what was coming. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect you, Mark. But if they find us..." She trailed off, her voice heavy with the weight of what they might face. They sat in the cold, dark cave, listening to the sound of the ship hovering above them, the hum of its engines growing louder as it searched for any sign of movement. Mark couldn't help but feel trapped. He had no idea how long they could hide. The Gorathians were relentless, and they wouldn't give up easily. Then, in the distance, he heard it, a sound like a voice, faint but clear, coming from above. "They've landed," Lyra whispered. "They're getting closer." Mark's heart raced again. He couldn't help but wonder how long they could stay hidden. Would they survive this? And what would happen if the Gorathians found them? Lyra reached out and squeezed his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "We're not alone," she said, her voice low. "We'll fight them together." Mark nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what they would face, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. The cave was cold, and Mark's breath came out in visible puffs, but he couldn't focus on the temperature. His mind raced, unable to quiet the thoughts swirling in his head. They were trapped. The Gorathians were closer now, and there was no way out unless Lyra had a plan, one he didn't know yet. Lyra was sitting against the far wall, her body still and tense. Her dark eyes were focused, but her expression seemed distant. It was clear she was thinking, strategizing, but Mark couldn't tell what was going on inside her head. He shifted his position, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "How much time do we have?" he whispered, trying not to break the stillness that had settled over the cave. Lyra didn't answer right away. She was looking up at the ceiling, her eyes narrowed as if she could sense something beyond the physical world. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "They're here," she said, her voice low and filled with tension. Mark froze. He didn't know how she could tell, but he believed her. The hum of the ship had become a constant in the background, but now it felt closer, almost suffocating. "What are we going to do?" Mark asked, his voice rising with the panic he tried so hard to hold back. He knew the situation was critical, but he didn't know how to fight against something he couldn't even see. Lyra stood up, her movements smooth and deliberate. She was in control. She had to be. The fate of both their lives depended on it. "They're searching the area," Lyra said quietly, her eyes scanning the cave's entrance. "They won't stop until they find me. But if we're smart, we can outsmart them." Mark stared at her, unsure what she meant. "How?" Lyra turned toward him, her eyes locking with his. "The Gorathians are advanced, but they aren't perfect. Their technology is powerful, but they rely on machines to track us. They can't always detect energy the way my people can. If we stay hidden long enough, they'll think we've left." Mark nodded slowly, but deep down, he didn't feel convinced. The ship hovering above them was a constant reminder that they were not safe. The Gorathians wouldn't give up. They had to do more than just hide. "So we wait," Mark said. It wasn't a question, but a statement, "and hope they leave." Lyra didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice steady. "No," she said firmly. "We fight." Mark blinked in surprise. "Fight? How are we supposed to fight them?" Lyra stepped closer, her expression hardening. "I have abilities, Mark. Things I can do that might give us an edge. But you..." She paused, her gaze softening for just a moment. "You have something they can't predict." Mark felt a wave of confusion wash over him. What do you mean? I don't have any powers, Lyra. I'm just a regular guy. You're not just a regular guy, Lyra said with a slight smile. You're human, and that's the key. The Gorathians underestimate humans. They think you're weak, easily controlled. They don't realize that your unpredictability is your greatest strength. Mark frowned. I don't understand. Lyra's smile faded, replaced by a more serious look. You'll understand soon enough. But for now, you need to trust me. Mark nodded, trying to calm his nerves. Trust her. He had no choice. She had already saved his life once, and now they were in this together. He had to trust her, no matter how strange the situation felt. The sound of the Gorathian ship above grew louder, and the vibrations in the air felt stronger. Mark could feel it in his chest now, the pressure of their presence. They were close. Lyra moved swiftly toward the cave's entrance and knelt, her hands hovering over the ground, as if she were reaching for something. Mark watched, wondering what she was doing. Then the ground shifted beneath them. Mark took a step back, his heart leaping in surprise. The entrance of the cave began to change, almost like it was folding in on itself. The rock and dirt shifted, forming a solid barrier that sealed the opening completely. What the? Mark started, his voice trailing off in disbelief. Lyra stood up and dusted her hands off. This is one of my people's defenses, she said. It's a kind of energy shield. It won't block them entirely, but it will hide us long enough. Mark's jaw dropped. He had no idea how Lyra had done that, but he didn't have time to question it. The hum of the ship grew louder, and Mark knew they couldn't wait much longer. Will it hold them off? Mark asked, his voice tense. Lyra nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. It will for a while, but we can't stay here forever. Mark's mind raced. What happens if they find us? Lyra's expression hardened. Then we fight. Mark glanced toward the back of the cave, where he saw only shadows. What exactly do you mean by fight, Lyra? She met his gaze, her eyes cold and serious. You'll see. Mark wasn't sure what she meant, but he could feel the urgency in her words. The ship's presence above them was growing stronger. It wouldn't be long now before they made their move. The air in the cave seemed to thrum with anticipation. Lyra stood ready, her posture tense, her eyes scanning the entrance as if waiting for the first sign of movement. Mark took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He had no idea how this was going to play out, but he knew one thing. He couldn't turn back now. Suddenly, the faintest sound reached their ears, something moving above, circling. They're here, Lyra whispered. Get ready. Mark's heart pounded as he readied himself. There was no more running, no more hiding. The Gorathians were here, and they were ready to fight. The silence inside the cave was deafening. Mark stood in the shadows, barely able to breathe as he waited for the inevitable. His mind raced with questions. How would they fight back? What kind of enemies were they facing? And most of all, how could he help? He glanced at Lyra, who stood near the entrance, her eyes focused on the energy shield she had created. The cave was now completely sealed off, but it wouldn't last forever. The Gorathians were relentless, and Mark had no doubt they'd find a way in eventually. We don't have much time, Lyra said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't need to say more. Mark could hear the ship above, circling them like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The hum of its engines was louder now, vibrating through the ground, making the air feel heavy with tension. Mark shifted on his feet, trying to steady his breathing. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest, but he had no idea what to do. He was just a regular guy. What could he possibly do against a race that had the technology to track them across an entire planet? Then, without warning, the first strike came. The cave trembled as a force slammed into the energy shield Lyra had created. Mark nearly lost his balance, his hands flying out to steady himself against the cold stone wall. The vibration sent a sharp jolt through his body, and he could hear the low growl of the ship's engines outside, a sign that they had just tested the barrier. Lyra didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, her eyes narrowing. "They're testing us," she muttered, barely audible. "Seeing if the shield will hold." Mark's stomach twisted. He had no idea how long the shield would last, but he knew one thing. They couldn't let the Gorathians know how weak it was. They had to make the first move. "Lyra," Mark said, his voice tight. "What do we do now?" Lyra's gaze met his, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, without a word, she stepped closer to him, her movements fluid and silent. Her hand reached out, and before Mark could react, she placed it on his shoulder. "Stay close," she said softly, her eyes locking with his. "When they come inside, we fight together." Mark felt a strange sense of calm wash over him at her words. He wasn't sure if it was the fear of what was to come or the quiet confidence in Lyra's voice, but he nodded. There was no turning back now. He was already in this, and whatever happened next, he would stand by her side. The minutes stretched on like hours as they waited in the cave, listening to the growing sound of the Gorathian ship above. The hum of its engines filled the air, vibrating through the walls, and making Mark's nerves feel raw. Then suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the cave, and the ground shook again. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The ship had fired. The shield was being tested again. This time, however, it didn't hold. With a violent tremor, the barrier around the cave shattered, the energy field flickering out of existence with a hiss. Mark's eyes widened in horror as the shield collapsed, and he could feel the weight of the situation crashing down on him. "They're inside," Lyra said quietly, her voice like steel. "Get ready." Before Mark could respond, the entrance of the cave began to glow with an eerie blue light. Mark's breath caught in his throat as a figure appeared in the doorway, tall and imposing. It was a Gorathian soldier, its body covered in dark armor that seemed to shimmer with unnatural energy. Its eyes glowed bright blue, the only visible part of its face behind a helmet that covered everything else. Another soldier appeared beside the first, and then another. Within moments, 3 heavily armored figures were standing in the entrance, their weapons raised. The Gorathians had arrived. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to stay put. He couldn't leave Lyra. He couldn't leave the only ally he had in this battle. He tightened his fists, trying to prepare for whatever was coming next. Lyra stepped forward, her posture rigid, her eyes focused on the Gorathians. She raised one hand slightly, and the air around her seemed to shimmer with energy. Mark could feel the pressure of her power building, the air crackling as if charged with electricity. He had no idea how she was doing it, but he could sense the raw strength in her movements. The first Gorathian soldier raised its weapon and pointed it directly at Lyra, but before it could fire, she moved. She was faster than Mark had ever seen her before. In a blur of motion, she was on the Gorathian, her hand coming down on its arm, forcing it to drop its weapon. The other 2 soldiers fired in quick succession, but Lyra dodged both shots with inhuman speed, her movements too quick to track. Mark was stunned by what he was witnessing. She wasn't just fast, she was like a shadow, moving with grace and deadly precision. She was a force of nature. The Gorathians were relentless, though. One of them lunged at her, its claws reaching for her throat, but Lyra ducked under its grasp and twisted, sending the soldier crashing to the ground. The remaining soldier swung its weapon at her, but Mark saw her make a split-second decision. She grabbed the weapon mid-swing, twisting it out of the soldier's hand and using its momentum to flip it onto its back. Mark had never seen anything like this. Lyra was a warrior, a force to be reckoned with. But as Lyra stood over the fallen soldiers, her expression changed. She looked up at Mark, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of concern in her eyes. "There are more of them," she said quietly. "They'll keep coming." Mark's stomach twisted. He couldn't keep up with her, but he had to try. If they didn't end this soon, they wouldn't survive. The fight wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. The cave was a mess. Rocks lay scattered on the ground, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and burned metal. Mark's heart was still racing, his pulse pounding in his ears. The Gorathians had come, more of them than Mark had ever expected. But Lyra had held her ground. She had taken down the first wave with speed and precision, but Mark knew that wasn't the end of it. They weren't done yet. Lyra was standing in the center of the cave, catching her breath, her dark hair damp with sweat. Her eyes were alert, scanning the entrance, waiting for the next attack. Mark stood beside her, trying to calm his own breathing, but the fear was still there. They had barely survived the first round. How much longer could they keep this up? "They're coming," Lyra said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Mark tensed. He could hear the faint hum of the Gorathian ship circling above, and then the sound of heavy footsteps. The Gorathians were regrouping. This time, they wouldn't be caught off guard. Mark looked down at the small pile of rocks near his feet, then at Lyra. She was ready. Her stance was firm, her hands crackling with energy. She had already shown him what she could do, but Mark knew the next battle would be different. The Gorathians wouldn't make the same mistakes. "Lyra," Mark said, his voice shaky but determined. "What's the plan? How do we win this?" Lyra glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "We don't win by fighting them head-on. We need to outsmart them." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Outsmart them? How do you plan to do that?" Before Lyra could answer, the entrance of the cave lit up. The Gorathians had arrived. 3 more soldiers stepped into the cave, their heavy armor clanking as they moved. Their eyes glowed blue through their helmets, and their weapons were raised, aimed at Lyra. Mark's stomach twisted. He had seen what she could do, but even she couldn't take on all of them. The soldiers spread out, forming a circle around Lyra. Mark's heart raced. This was it. There was no way they could fight all of them. And when Lyra raised her hand, her eyes focused on the Gorathians. "Stay back," she whispered to Mark. "This is my fight." Mark wanted to protest, but before he could say anything, Lyra moved. In the blink of an eye, she was at the closest soldier, twisting its weapon from its hand and using it to slam the soldier into the wall. The others fired, but she was already gone, moving with such speed it was impossible to track her. Mark watched, his breath caught in his throat. She was incredible. She was like a blur of movement, a storm in the cave, each strike landing with precision and power. The Gorathians were fast, but they couldn't match Lyra's agility. But Mark knew they weren't going to give up that easily. As Lyra knocked out the second soldier, the third one raised its weapon, aiming straight for her chest. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, Mark rushed forward, throwing himself between Lyra and the weapon. The blast hit him in the side, and he cried out in pain as he stumbled back, falling to the ground. "No!" Lyra shouted, her eyes wide in horror. She turned to the soldier, her fury evident. But before she could act, Mark reached out, grabbing her arm. "I'm okay," he said through gritted teeth, his chest tight from the impact. "I'm fine. We've got to finish this." Lyra looked down at him, her face filled with concern, but she nodded. They didn't have time for anything else. The third soldier hesitated for just a moment, and that was enough. Lyra surged forward, her energy pulsing in the air around her. She grabbed the soldier's weapon and threw it to the side, her hands moving like lightning to take the soldier down. Within seconds, it was over. The last Gorathian soldier was on the ground, unconscious. Mark pushed himself to his feet, his side throbbing with pain. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to stay upright. "Is that it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Lyra looked around the cave, her eyes searching the shadows. She didn't answer right away, but Mark could see the weariness in her eyes. They were far from safe. There had to be more Gorathians out there, and they would come back. They wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. "We've got to move," Lyra said, her voice low but urgent. "They'll be back soon." Mark nodded, his legs shaking as he tried to steady himself. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and the pain in his side was growing sharper, but he couldn't focus on that now. They had to get out of the cave. They had to get somewhere safe. Lyra turned toward the back of the cave, where a narrow tunnel led deeper into the mountain. Mark didn't hesitate. He followed her, limping slightly as he moved. They couldn't stay here. The Gorathians would come looking, and they needed to find a place to regroup. The tunnel was dark, and the air was thick with dust, but Mark didn't care. His only focus was staying close to Lyra, making sure they both made it out of this alive. As they moved deeper into the mountain, Mark's thoughts raced. They had survived the Gorathians' first attack, but the danger wasn't over. What would happen next? Where would they go? And what was Lyra's plan for getting rid of the Gorathians once and for all? Lyra glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "We're not out of this yet, Mark, but we're going to make it. Together." Mark looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. Together. He wasn't alone anymore. He was part of this fight, whether he was ready for it or not. And with Lyra by his side, maybe they had a chance. They kept moving, step by step, deeper into the mountain. And as they went, Mark knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, he was ready to face it. With Lyra's strength and his determination, they could take on anything.